My name is Clara Whitfield, and I am 26 years old. At exactly 11:43 that night, I was sitting barefoot on a cracked concrete floor behind the same mansion people online used to call the Whitfield estate. The mosquitoes were terrible. I could still hear the faint hum of the fountain from the main building, and honestly, that sound alone made me want to cry harder. Because just a few hours earlier, I had still been living inside that house. Now my clothes were packed inside black trash bags beside me. One of the bags had split open during the argument, so half my things were scattered across the wet ground. My graduation picture frame was broken. One heel from my wedding shoe was snapped clean off. And sitting beside all of it was my husband, Ryan Keller, wearing soaked gray sweatpants while scrubbing soap off my mother's white Mercedes-Benz like he worked for her. I still remember staring at his hands. His fingers were red from detergent and cold water. And the worst part? He kept pretending he was okay because he didn't want me breaking down again. But I was already falling apart. A few security guards stood nearby pretending not to watch us, though every now and then I'd catch one of them looking over with pity. Inside the mansion, lights glowed through the tall windows while soft jazz music played from the dining area like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just been thrown out of my own home. Then the back door opened. Margaret Hale stepped outside slowly with a glass of wine in her hand. Perfect makeup. Silk robe. Calm face. You'd think she had just returned from a charity dinner instead of destroying her daughter's life. "Well," she said casually, leaning against the railing, "you wanted independence. Now you have it." I stood up so fast the plastic chair behind me flipped over. "You froze my accounts." I screamed. "You fired me. You threw us out like animals." Ryan quickly grabbed my arm before I could move closer to her. Margaret took a slow sip from her wine before answering. "You should have thought about that before disrespecting me." I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny. It was shock. The kind that makes your chest hurt. "Respect?" I asked. "You made my husband wash your clothes." She shrugged. "He's unemployed." Ryan quietly told me to calm down, but I could feel years of pain building in my throat all at once. Childhood memories. Empty graduations. Silent birthdays. Nights I cried myself to sleep wondering why my own mother looked at me like I was a burden she regretted carrying. And standing there in that moment, I realized something terrifying. Margaret never loved me. Not even a little. Then something happened that changed everything. An unfamiliar black SUV pulled up outside the compound gate. Margaret's expression changed immediately. Not fear exactly. But panic. Real panic. She placed her wine glass down so quickly it almost tipped over. I turned toward the gate confused while the headlights cut through the darkness. Someone stepped out of the vehicle, and the moment Margaret saw the man clearly, all the color drained from her face. That was the first time in my life I looked at the woman I called Mom. And realized she had been hiding something huge from me for years. And trust me, what I discovered before sunrise completely destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. But before I continue, do me a small favor. If this story resonates with you in any way, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And honestly, I'd really love to know, what time is it where you're watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I was the only child of Edward Whitfield, the late founder of Whitfield Holdings International, one of the biggest real estate and logistics companies in America. At least that was the version of my life people saw from the outside. To the world, I was the lucky daughter of a billionaire family. The little girl living inside a massive estate with luxury cars lined outside, expensive chandeliers hanging from the ceilings, and house staff greeting guests at the front doors every day. People used to look at me with envy during charity events and say things like, "You're so blessed, Clara." And honestly, as a kid, I used to wonder why being blessed felt so lonely. After my father died during a business trip to London, my mother took over Whitfield Holdings and became the company's CEO. Overnight, she became one of the most respected businesswomen in Chicago. She appeared in magazines, attended expensive galas, and spent most of her life inside conference rooms and airport lounges. Meanwhile, I grew up mostly alone inside a huge house that never truly felt warm. Most mornings, I woke up early hoping maybe that day would be different. Maybe my mother would sit with me during breakfast. Maybe she'd ask me how school was going. Maybe she'd hug me before leaving for work the way other mothers did. But instead, I usually heard the sharp sound of her heels moving quickly down the hallway while assistants followed behind her carrying files and coffee. Then she'd disappear for the entire day. No hugs. No forehead kisses. No, have a great day at school. Just silence. By the time I turned 8, I had already started noticing the difference between my life and everyone else's. Every morning at school drop-off, fathers carried backpacks, fixed ponytails, kissed their daughters goodbye, and waved dramatically from car windows while mothers laughed beside them. Some kids even complained about their parents embarrassing them too much. I used to watch all of it quietly from the back seat of our black SUV. Meanwhile, our driver, Mr. Lewis, would simply stop at the school entrance and say, "Have a good day, Miss Clara." That was it. One afternoon, after watching a little girl hug her father tightly near the school gate, something crossed my mind that sounds silly now, but back then it felt very real. The only older man I constantly saw around our house was Walter, our elderly gateman. He was kind to me. Sometimes he secretly gave me candy whenever my mother wasn't around. So later that evening, I walked into my mother's home office holding my math notebook against my chest and quietly asked, "Mom, is Walter my dad?" The room went completely silent. My mother slowly removed her glasses and stared at me for a moment before forcing a smile. "No, Clara," she said softly. "Your father traveled overseas for work. He'll come back someday." At that age, I believed every word. I held on to that hope for years. Even though I attended one of the best private schools in Chicago, my life still felt painfully empty. My mother never attended school plays, never came to parent meetings, and never cared much about my emotional needs. Whenever I needed help with homework, she usually told me to ask the housemaid instead because she was busy. Then came my middle school graduation ceremony. That day still hurts when I think about it. I had won 3 academic awards, and the auditorium was packed with cheering parents carrying flowers, balloons, and cameras. One girl's father cried proudly when she walked across the stage. Another student ran straight into her mother's arms after receiving her certificate. I kept looking toward the entrance doors hoping my mother would walk in late. But she never came. Hours later, Mr. Lewis quietly collected my certificates and drove me home in silence. That night, I finally confronted my mother. And for the first time in my life, she admitted the truth. My father had died years earlier during a business trip to London. I remember sitting frozen on the edge of my bed after she left the room. My chest hurt so badly I could barely breathe. Because in that moment, I realized something heartbreaking. Not only was my father gone, I had spent my entire childhood waiting for someone who was never coming back. As I grew older, the distance between my mother and me somehow became worse instead of better. Most people assume children from wealthy homes have easy lives. I used to think that too when I was younger. But the older I got, the more I realized money can hide a lot of pain. By the time I turned 16, our mansion no longer felt like a home to me. It felt like a place where I constantly had to earn the right to exist. And the strange part was, none of it made sense. We had 3 housemaids, a private chef, a laundry service that came twice a week. Yet somehow, I became responsible for the hardest chores inside the house. Every evening after school, while my classmates relaxed, watched movies, or went shopping with their families, I was usually standing inside the kitchen washing dishes until my fingers wrinkled from soap and hot water. Some nights I cleaned the marble staircases alone while the maids stayed downstairs watching television. Other nights, my mother deliberately left piles of laundry on my bed before leaving for work trips. At first, I honestly thought maybe she wanted me to learn discipline. But eventually, it started feeling personal. One night, around 1 a.m., I was still downstairs scrubbing burnt sauce from expensive cooking pans after preparing dinner for guests my mother invited over. I remember staring out the kitchen window while tears quietly rolled down my face. Outside, snow was falling softly across the backyard lights. The entire house was asleep except me. I kept thinking about how different my life might have been if my father were still alive. Maybe he would have noticed how exhausted I looked. Maybe he would have defended me. Maybe he would have loved me enough to ask if I was okay. Then suddenly, my mother's voice echoed from upstairs. "Clara." I quickly wiped my face before running toward the staircase. She stood there wearing a silk robe with her arms crossed. "You missed a spot in the dining room," she said coldly. I stared at her for a second, completely drained. "Mom." "It's almost morning," I whispered. Her expression didn't change at all. And I don't know why, but something inside me broke a little that night. Because no matter how hard I tried, nothing was ever enough for her. Whenever I complained, she always used the same excuse. "I'm teaching you responsibility." But deep down, it never felt like training. It felt like punishment. And honestly, what hurt the most wasn't even the chores. It was the lack of love behind everything. There were no moments where she sat beside me afterward and said, "I'm proud of you." No warmth. No balance. Just criticism and control. Then came college applications. For the first time in years, I felt excited about something. I wanted to study business administration because despite everything, I still admired the empire my father built. Somewhere deep inside me, I hoped maybe joining the company one day would finally make my mother proud of me. I still remember walking into her office with my acceptance letter in my hands. My heart was racing from excitement. "Mom," I said with a smile, "I got accepted into the business program at Northridge University." At first, she looked surprised. Then slowly, her smile disappeared. Not disappointment exactly. Something colder. "You should study medicine instead," she said flatly. "Business is stressful for women." I laughed nervously because I genuinely thought she was joking. But she wasn't. For almost an hour, she tried convincing me to become a doctor instead. She talked about stability, reputation, and how healthcare careers were more appropriate. Still, I politely refused. "I want to help run Whitfield Holdings someday," I told her carefully. "Dad built something incredible. I want to continue it." The silence that followed felt heavy. Then she gave me a smile that didn't feel real at all. "Well," she said quietly, "if that's what you want." But from that day forward, something changed completely between us. Her attitude became colder. Sharper. Almost resentful. And I couldn't understand why my own mother looked angry every time I talked about my future. College became another lonely chapter of my life. From the outside, everyone assumed I was living some perfect billionaire lifestyle. The daughter of the CEO of Whitfield Holdings. Expensive clothes. Luxury vacations. Unlimited money. People saw my last name and automatically believed I had everything. What they didn't know was that most months, I sat in my dorm room refreshing my banking app over and over because my allowance still hadn't arrived. Sometimes my roommates would casually ask, "Clara, didn't your mom just buy another penthouse downtown?" And I'd force a laugh like everything was normal. Meanwhile, I was secretly calculating whether I could stretch instant noodles for another 3 days. The weirdest part was that my mother always had money for public appearances. Charity galas. Designer handbags. Business flights to Paris. But somehow, sending money to her own daughter always came late with long lectures attached to it. Learn responsibility. Money isn't everything. You depend too much on people. At some point, I stopped asking for help completely. And honestly, the silence hurt even more than the financial struggle. Weeks would pass without her calling me. No, how are your classes? No, did you eat today? Nothing. Sometimes I'd stare at my phone at night wondering if maybe she was busy and would eventually remember me. But she rarely did. Then came the evening that changed my entire life. It was late October during my sophomore year. Cold rain hammered against the university buildings after evening lectures, and students rushed across campus trying not to get soaked. I remember sitting outside the business faculty under a small concrete shelter with tears rolling down my face while everyone walked past me pretending not to notice. A few minutes earlier, my mother had sent me a message after I told her I needed money for textbooks. Instead of helping, she replied, "If you focused on becoming useful instead of emotional, maybe life would be easier for you." I must have read that message 20 times. And for some reason, that night it hit differently. Maybe because I was exhausted. Maybe because I was tired of begging for basic affection from my own mother. I just sat there crying quietly while rainwater splashed across the sidewalk in front of me. Then suddenly, someone stopped nearby. A male voice said softly, "You know you're getting rained on, right?" I looked up and saw a tall guy holding a black umbrella awkwardly over both of us. His hoodie sleeves were damp, and his sneakers looked completely ruined from the rain. That was how I met Ryan Keller. At first, I wiped my face quickly because I hated crying in front of strangers. But instead of asking annoying questions, he simply sat beside me like we already knew each other. Then he pulled a slightly crushed turkey sandwich from his backpack and handed it to me. "I was saving this for later," he said awkwardly. But honestly, heartbreak scenes look less dramatic when somebody's hungry. I stared at him for 2 seconds before laughing unexpectedly. A real laugh. The kind I hadn't heard from myself in years. And somehow, that small moment cracked something open inside me. Ryan came from a completely different world than mine. His father was a retired factory mechanic with constant back pain, and his mother owned a tiny roadside diner outside Chicago. They struggled financially almost every month. Sometimes Ryan worked night shifts fixing campus equipment just to support himself. But despite all that, his family had something mine never did. Warmth. The first time I visited their home during Thanksgiving break, his mother hugged me before I even sat down. His father argued loudly over football while everybody laughed around the dinner table eating homemade pie from paper plates. It felt messy. Loud. Imperfect. And somehow beautiful. I remember sitting there watching them interact and realizing something painful. I had spent my entire childhood in luxury without ever truly feeling loved. And slowly, without even planning it, I fell in love with Ryan because he made me feel safe in ways money never could. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Protected. Chosen. By the time Ryan and I had been dating for almost a year, he had become the safest part of my life. He knew things about me nobody else did. The way I shut down emotionally whenever my mother criticized me. The fact that I hated loud arguments because growing up, silence in our house usually meant anger was coming. Even small things, like how I always apologized too much for existing in people's spaces. Ryan noticed everything. And somehow, instead of making me feel weak, he made me feel understood. So eventually, I decided it was time to introduce him to my mother. Honestly, I was terrified. Not because Ryan wasn't good enough, but because my mother cared deeply about status, appearances, and power. Ryan came from a struggling middle-class family. No connections. No wealthy background. No fancy last name. The entire drive to the estate that weekend, my stomach twisted with anxiety. "You okay?" Ryan asked while parking near the front fountain. I forced a smile. "Yeah. I just don't know how this is gonna go." He reached over and squeezed my hand gently. "Then we survive it together." That one sentence calmed me more than he probably realized. When we entered the mansion, my mother was sitting in the living room reviewing documents with two assistants nearby. She looked up slowly when she saw Ryan beside me. For a second, I prepared myself for disappointment. But then something unexpected happened. She smiled. Not the cold, forced smile she usually gave me during public events. An actual smile. "Well," she said warmly while standing up, "so this is Ryan." I think Ryan was even more shocked than I was. The entire evening felt strangely perfect. My mother asked him questions about school, offered him dessert herself, and even laughed at one of his jokes during dinner. At some point, she told him he was grounded and respectful, which honestly sounded close enough to approval coming from her. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe college had changed her. Maybe she was finally softening toward me. Maybe we could actually become a normal family. I remember lying awake smiling that night because I felt stupidly happy. But that feeling didn't last long. 3 nights later, around midnight, I came downstairs to grab water from the kitchen after studying. As I passed my mother's office, I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. At first, I wasn't paying attention. Then I heard Ryan's name. I stopped walking immediately. My mother was on the phone laughing softly, the kind of relaxed laugh she almost never used around me. "I'm actually glad she picked a poor man," she said casually. "It'll make controlling both of them much easier." I felt my entire body freeze. For a second, I honestly thought I misunderstood her. But then she continued talking. "Someone with money would have complicated things. This way, they'll always need me." The glass cup in my hand nearly slipped from my fingers. I stood outside that office completely numb while her words repeated in my head over and over again. Controlling both of them. Not helping us. Not supporting us. Controlling us. Suddenly, every nice thing she did around Ryan started feeling fake. Calculated. Like she had already created some invisible plan in her head without me realizing it. I quietly walked back upstairs before she noticed me. But that night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept staring at the ceiling, replaying her voice in my mind. And honestly, that was the moment something changed permanently inside me. For the first time in my life, I stopped seeing my mother as simply strict or emotionally distant. Something deeper was wrong. After that night, I became more careful around her. I stopped telling her certain things about my relationship. I avoided discussing future plans around her too much. But deep down, one terrifying question kept growing louder in my mind. Why did my own mother seem so desperate to control every part of my life? After graduation, my mother finally offered me a position at Whitfield Holdings International as an operations supervisor. I still remember how excited I felt walking into headquarters on my first day. The building itself was massive, glass walls, polished elevators, employees moving quickly with tablets and coffee cups in their hands. My father's name was displayed in silver letters across the lobby entrance, and honestly, I felt proud. For the first time in years, I thought maybe things were finally changing between my mother and me. Maybe she was beginning to trust me. Maybe she finally saw me as family instead of a burden. But that illusion didn't last long. The very first shock came during payroll. My salary was so low I genuinely thought accounting had made a mistake. Meanwhile, some department assistants earned more than I did. When I carefully brought it up to my mother, she didn't even look up from her laptop. "You should be grateful you even have a position," she replied coldly. After that, things only became worse. Every week felt like another humiliation. If I arrived 3 minutes late because of traffic, money disappeared from my paycheck. If a presentation had one typo, she embarrassed me publicly during meetings. Sometimes she criticized me so harshly in front of senior staff that I could physically feel the room becoming uncomfortable. One morning, during an operations review meeting, she slammed a file onto the conference table and looked directly at me. "Do you even understand how businesses work, Clara?" she snapped. "Or did college teach you absolutely nothing?" Nobody spoke. I remember gripping my pen so tightly my fingers hurt while 20 employees avoided looking at me. And the painful part was, I worked harder than almost everyone there. I stayed late, skipped lunch breaks, took work home constantly. Still, nothing I did was ever enough for her. Around that same period, Ryan proposed to me quietly one evening near the lake outside downtown Chicago. No cameras. No fancy setup. Just him nervously holding a small ring box while his hands shook in the cold. And honestly, it was one of the happiest moments of my life. A few months later, we got married in a simple court ceremony with only a few close friends present. Ryan's parents cried during the vows. My mother attended, but she spent most of the ceremony answering work calls outside. After the wedding, Ryan and I planned to move into his tiny apartment near the west side. It wasn't luxurious at all, but I didn't care. For once, I wanted peace. But my mother refused immediately. "You both should stay at the estate," she insisted. "It'll make your work schedule easier." At first, I argued gently. But then she reminded me that my position at Whitfield Holdings depended entirely on her approval. So eventually, I gave in. At that time, Ryan was still searching for engineering jobs after graduation. He spent most days applying online and attending interviews. And somehow, my mother used that against him. At first, it started small. "Ryan, can you help move these boxes?" "Ryan, wash the SUV before the guests arrive." "Ryan, take these clothes downstairs." But slowly, it became constant. One afternoon, I left work early after forgetting some important documents at home. As I walked around the back side of the estate, I suddenly froze. Ryan was outside beside the laundry area. His sleeves were rolled up. Soap covered his hands. And sitting beside him were my mother's expensive designer clothes soaking inside a plastic basin. He was hand-washing them. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe properly. Ryan looked up and immediately went pale after seeing me standing there. And right then, something inside me completely broke. That night, years of pain finally exploded out of me. I didn't even wait for my mother to settle down after returning from work. The second she stepped into the living room removing her gloves and talking to one of her assistants on speakerphone, I walked straight toward her shaking with anger. Ryan kept trying to stop me quietly behind the stairs. "Clara. Calm down first," he whispered nervously. But I couldn't. "Not anymore. Why is my husband washing your clothes?" I shouted. The entire room went silent instantly. Even the housemaids froze. My mother slowly turned toward me with that same cold expression she always used whenever she wanted to make me feel small. "What exactly is the problem?" she asked calmly. I actually laughed from disbelief. "The problem?" I repeated. "You've treated me like garbage my whole life, and now you're humiliating my husband too." Ryan stepped closer, trying to calm things down, but at that point I was crying too hard to stop. Years of swallowed emotions were pouring out of me all at once. "I kept defending you," I screamed. I kept telling myself maybe you were just stressed. Maybe business made you this way. But this? My mother remained frighteningly calm. Then she said the sentence that changed everything inside me forever. He's unemployed, she replied coldly. At least he should make himself useful. The room became so quiet I could hear the ticking clock near the staircase. And suddenly, the phone conversation I overheard years ago came rushing back into my mind. I'm glad she chose a poor man. Controlling both of them will be easier. That was it. That was the moment everything finally connected. My mother never supported my marriage because she cared about my happiness. She supported it because she thought poor people would always depend on her. Easier to manipulate. Easier to control. I stared at her in complete disbelief. And honestly, for the first time in my life, I felt afraid of my own mother. The next morning, I refused to go to work. I stayed inside the guest room crying while Ryan sat beside me trying to comfort me. Around evening, my mother finally returned from the office and knocked once before entering. If you don't report to work tomorrow, she said flatly, consider yourself fired. I didn't answer her. For once, I was too emotionally exhausted to care. The following afternoon, while Ryan and I were eating quietly downstairs, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Human Resources. My hand started shaking before I even opened it. Termination notice. Effective immediately. I stared at the screen completely numb. But then things became even worse. When I tried transferring money from my savings account later that evening, every single transaction failed. One account after another. Frozen. My chest tightened instantly. By the time my mother returned home that night, I completely lost emotional control. You froze my accounts. I screamed while following her through the hallway. How could you do this to me? Ryan kept trying to pull me back gently while house staff watched nervously from a distance. But my mother looked almost emotionless. Then she delivered the final blow. You and your husband will move into the boys' quarters tomorrow morning, she said casually. You're no longer welcome inside the main house. I honestly thought she was bluffing. Until sunrise came. Security guards arrived carrying cardboard boxes and black trash bags. They moved our belongings out room by room while neighbors and staff members quietly watched from outside. My wedding dress was tossed carelessly into one of the bags. My framed graduation photo shattered against the pavement. And standing there watching strangers remove my entire life from the mansion. I felt something inside me break in a way I cannot fully explain. That first night inside the boys' quarters felt unreal. The room smelled damp. The ceiling fan barely worked. Mosquitoes buzzed loudly around us while water dripped slowly from a leaking pipe near the bathroom door. Just 24 hours earlier, I had still been sleeping inside one of the most luxurious estates in Chicago. Now I was sitting on a thin mattress placed directly on the floor, crying into my hands while Ryan held me quietly against his chest. Neither of us spoke much. Honestly, I think we were both too emotionally exhausted to process what had happened. At some point after midnight, while staring at the pile of boxes security guards dumped carelessly near the wall, something suddenly crossed my mind. A business card. Years earlier, during one of the few family gatherings I could vaguely remember, my uncle had slipped me a card quietly before leaving. I was probably around 14 at the time. Call me if you ever need anything, he had said gently. Back then, I didn't think much about it. But that night, something inside me told me to find it. I immediately began opening dusty boxes desperately while Ryan looked confused beside me. Clothes scattered everywhere. Papers covered the floor. My hands shook badly from panic and exhaustion. Then finally, I found it. The old white card was bent at the corners, but the number was still visible. I called immediately. The second my uncle answered, I completely broke down crying. I told him everything. The humiliation. The firing. The frozen accounts. The boys' quarters. Ryan washing my mother's clothes. The line became silent for a few seconds. Then his voice changed completely. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he said coldly. The next day around 9 a.m., a black SUV pulled into the compound unexpectedly. Ryan was outside washing my mother's white Mercedes again while I sat nearby feeling completely numb. The moment my uncle stepped out of the vehicle and saw us, his entire expression changed. I had never seen a grown man look that angry before. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. Ryan immediately stood up awkwardly, soap still covering his hands. I tried explaining everything through tears, but my uncle already looked furious enough to explode. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call right there in front of us. "I need you here tonight," he said sharply. No delays. That same evening, everything changed forever. My uncle ordered everyone inside the mansion living room, including house staff, security guards, assistants, everyone. When my mother walked through the front doors after work and saw him sitting there waiting, she stopped instantly. For the first time in my life, I saw fear on her face. Not annoyance. Not anger. Fear. "Why are you here?" she asked carefully. Instead of answering, my uncle looked toward the entrance as another man stepped inside. An elderly attorney wearing a dark gray suit entered carrying a leather briefcase. "Good evening," he said calmly. "My name is Raymond Pierce." The room suddenly felt unbearably tense. My mother's hand started trembling slightly. She quickly tried pulling my uncle aside for a private conversation, but he refused immediately. "No," he said firmly. "Everything will be discussed here." I remember looking around completely confused while Ryan stood quietly beside me holding my hand. Then my uncle slowly turned toward me. His eyes were already filled with tears. "Clara," he said painfully. "Margaret is not your biological mother." The entire room froze. I swear my heart actually stopped beating for a second. "What?" I whispered. My mother immediately started shaking her head. But the lawyer opened his briefcase calmly and removed several documents. Then the horrifying truth finally came out. Margaret had once been my nanny. After my real parents died during that London trip, she was temporarily trusted to raise me while helping oversee Whitfield Holdings until I became old enough to inherit everything legally. Everything suddenly made sense. The coldness. The emotional distance. The constant control. The hatred hidden behind fake responsibility. I felt physically sick. Then Raymond Pierce delivered the final bombshell. Every company share. Every investment. Every property. Every account connected to my father's estate. Legally belonged to me. Not my mother. Me. The entire room fell into stunned silence. And for the first time in over 20 years, the woman who controlled my entire life looked completely powerless. The silence inside the living room that night felt almost unbearable. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the house staff standing near the walls looked completely frozen after hearing the truth. I sat there staring at my mother while my entire world collapsed around me piece by piece. Or maybe it had already collapsed years ago and I just never realized it. My hands were trembling badly. Ryan kept holding onto them tightly, probably afraid I would faint. Honestly, I felt like I might. My chest hurt so much it became difficult to breathe normally. And then suddenly, my mother broke down. Not the controlled tears she used during public interviews. Not fake emotion. This was ugly, desperate crying. She slowly dropped to her knees in the middle of the living room floor while tears ruined her makeup completely. "Clara." She sobbed uncontrollably. "Please. Please don't do this to me. I just stared at her silently. I raised you, she cried again. I took care of you your whole life. And hearing those words honestly made something twist painfully inside me. Because part of me wanted to scream back that she was right. She did raise me. She packed my school lunches sometimes. She signed report cards. She sat beside my hospital bed once when I had pneumonia at 12. But then another part of me remembered the darker things too. The empty graduations. The screaming. The punishments. The coldness. The loneliness. All those years I begged silently for affection from a woman who clearly saw me as a responsibility instead of a daughter. I felt tears running down my face again. So that's why. I whispered painfully. That's why you could never love me properly. My mother cried harder immediately. No, Clara, please. I did love you. But honestly, I didn't even know what love meant anymore at that point. Eventually, my uncle and the lawyer left after promising they would handle everything legally first thing in the morning. Ryan helped me back to the boys' quarters afterward, but neither of us slept that night. I just kept replaying everything in my head over and over again. By sunrise, something inside me had changed completely. The next morning, I noticed movement outside the main mansion windows. Curious, I stepped outside quietly. And there she was. My mother. Dressed for work exactly like always. Designer suit. Perfect heels. Hair neatly styled. As if the previous night had never happened. For a moment, I almost laughed from disbelief. Then I realized something important. She genuinely believed she would still remain CEO. Around 10 a.m., I arrived at Whitfield Holdings headquarters beside Raymond Pierce, the family lawyer. The moment we entered the building, employees started whispering immediately. People looked confused seeing me beside him. Some executives even stood up nervously as we walked toward the conference room. Inside, senior staff members were already seated around the long glass table while my mother prepared to begin the executive meeting. Then she looked up. And froze completely. You could actually feel the tension spread across the room. Raymond calmly placed several legal documents on the table before stepping aside. I took a slow breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. Then I looked directly at everyone inside that room and spoke clearly. My name is Clara Whitfield, I said. And I am the rightful owner and new CEO of Whitfield Holdings International. The entire conference room exploded into chaos. Some people gasped loudly. Others looked toward my mother in total disbelief. One executive even removed his glasses like he thought he heard wrong. Meanwhile, my mother sat completely speechless. And before she could say a single word, Raymond Pierce officially confirmed everything legally in front of the board. Then finally, after years of being silenced, controlled, and humiliated, I looked directly at my mother and said the words I never imagined I'd have the courage to speak. You're removed as CEO effective immediately. When we returned to the estate that evening, the atmosphere felt completely different. The same mansion that once made me feel small suddenly felt strangely quiet. Almost nervous. House staff who normally avoided eye contact with me were now greeting me respectfully. Security guards stood straighter whenever I walked past. Even the air inside the house felt heavier somehow, like everyone knew something irreversible had happened. But honestly, none of that mattered to me at that moment. I was emotionally exhausted. Ryan walked beside me quietly while Raymond Pierce finalized phone calls with the board upstairs. My head still hurt from everything that happened inside that conference room earlier. Then I heard crying again. Soft at first. Then louder. I turned toward the living room and saw my mother sitting on the floor beside the couch, still wearing the same expensive cream-colored suit from the office. Her makeup was ruined. Her hair was messy now. For the first time in my life, she didn't look powerful. She looked scared. The second she saw me, she rushed toward me desperately. "Clara, please," she cried while grabbing my hands. "Please don't leave me with nothing." I immediately froze. "I know I made mistakes," she continued shakily. "But I spent years building that company too. Please. Even if it's a small position. Let me stay." Ryan quietly stepped back, giving us space. And honestly, hearing her beg like that felt surreal. This was the same woman who once fired me through email. The same woman who froze my accounts. The same woman who watched security guards throw my belongings outside like trash. Now suddenly, she was the one terrified. I slowly pulled my hands away from hers. And then memories started hitting me one after another so hard it almost felt physical. Every graduation she ignored. Every birthday dinner she missed because of meetings. Every cruel insult inside conference rooms. Every night I cried myself to sleep wondering why my own mother couldn't love me properly. I remembered being 11 years old sitting alone after winning academic awards while other kids celebrated with their parents. I remembered washing dishes at midnight while housemaids laughed downstairs. I remembered Ryan standing outside washing her clothes with soap-covered hands while she sat comfortably inside the mansion drinking wine. And suddenly, I realized something painful. Even after discovering the truth about my real parents. The deepest wound wasn't the lies. It was the lack of love. My mother dropped to her knees again crying uncontrollably. "Please, Clara," she whispered. "I have nowhere else to go." For a few seconds, I couldn't speak at all. Part of me wanted revenge. Part of me wanted peace. And another part of me still mourned the mother I spent my entire childhood wishing she would become. Eventually, I stepped back slowly. "I can't forgive you," I said quietly. The look on her face after hearing those words is something you'll probably never forget. A few days later, Raymond officially removed her from all executive access connected to Whitfield Holdings International. Company vehicles were taken back. Her office was cleared. Her accounts were separated from the estate. And in the cruelest twist of fate, she was moved into the same boys' quarters where Ryan and I once suffered. At first, I wanted her removed from the property entirely. But Ryan kept pleading with me to show at least a little mercy. "Don't become the pain she gave you," he told me one night softly. So eventually, I agreed to let her remain on the estate only as part of the maintenance staff. Mostly outdoor cleaning and basic property duties. Nothing more. The woman who once controlled my entire life lost everything almost overnight. And strangely enough, revenge didn't feel as satisfying as I imagined it would. It just felt sad. Because for the first time in my entire life, I finally understood something important. Sometimes the people who hurt you the deepest are not strangers. They're the people who stand close enough to call themselves family, while quietly breaking you from the inside. And honestly, even after everything that happened, a part of me still mourned the mother I thought I had my entire life. Because sometimes the deepest pain isn't losing money, a house, or a company. It's realizing the person you loved never loved you the same way back. So now I really want to ask you something. Do you think I did the right thing by refusing to forgive my mother completely? Or do you think she deserved another chance after all those years? And honestly, if you were in my position, what would you have done differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to read them. Also, if this story touched you emotionally in any way, please take 1 second to like this video and share it with someone who loves emotional drama stories like this. It really helps the channel grow. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and turn on notifications for more powerful stories filled with drama, betrayal, emotional twists, and life lessons. Remember, not every wound is visible. Some people smile in luxury while silently suffering behind closed doors.